Maggie Thompson stood in front of the school bathroom mirror, her shoulders slightly hunched as she avoided her own reflection. At 17, she often felt as if the world was watching her, only not in a way that brought admiration or respect. It felt more like judgment, an unspoken criticism she could feel in every hallway stare and whispered comment. She knew what people said about her weight, even though she tried not to show how much it hurt. But today would be different. Today, it would cut deeper than ever. The Texas sky stretched out endlessly above her as Maggie walked toward her car after school. She hadn't gone far when her gas tank light flashed on, so she decided to stop at a roadside gas station. She was filling up her car, lost in thought, when the rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet. Her eyes flicked up, catching sight of a group of bikers rolling in, their engines loud and unapologetic, dominating the small station's parking lot. It was the Vultures, a local motorcycle gang everyone in town knew to avoid. At the center of the group was Razer, their notorious leader, a man whose cruel eyes were nearly as infamous as the long scar slashing across his cheek. Razer's gang was rough and unpredictable. They brought trouble wherever they went. Maggie's heart started to pound as she tried to look away, hoping they wouldn't notice her. But her hopes were dashed when Razer's voice boomed across the lot. "Hey, look at this one," he sneered, eyeing her with a twisted smirk. "Guess they've got buffet specials at the gas station now, huh?" His words sent a ripple of laughter through the gang, and Maggie felt her face grow hot as they all turned toward her, sneering, pointing, and throwing insults like stones. Each jeer, each mocking laugh stung, but Maggie stood frozen, humiliated, unable to even defend herself. She could see other customers looking on, but no one moved to help or even seemed to care. After what felt like an eternity, the bikers turned away, and Maggie quickly finished filling her tank, her hands shaking. She climbed into her car, feeling every bit of anger and shame that had been building in her chest. She drove home in silence, trying to swallow the hurt, but the memory of Razer's words and his gang's laughter clung to her like a shadow. When she got home, her father, John, was in the kitchen, and he immediately noticed her pale face and downcast eyes. John Thompson was a quiet, steady man with a strong frame and a presence that spoke of resilience. He had once been an elite SWAT officer, though he rarely talked about it. He had retired from that life to focus on raising Maggie alone after her mother left, and over the years, he'd transformed himself from a hard, battle-worn man into a loving, patient father. But there was a part of him that had never fully let go of that past. "Mags," he called softly, stepping toward her. "Are you all right?" Maggie tried to shrug it off, but her father's steady gaze saw through the mask. She could no longer hold back and finally opened up, recounting the cruel words, the humiliation, the jeering faces of Razer and his gang. With every word, John's face tightened, his expression growing darker. The pain in his daughter's eyes brought back something buried inside him, a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. That night, as Maggie went to bed, John sat alone in the dimly lit living room, his hands clenched and his mind racing. The image of Maggie standing alone against those men, mocked and defenseless, haunted him. Memories surfaced of his days in the SWAT unit, of the things he'd done and seen, the lines he'd crossed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He thought he had left that life behind, but now he wasn't so sure. As he sat in silence, memories collided with his present. Razer and his gang were dangerous, he knew that much. But something in him wouldn't let this go. He could almost feel his old instincts creeping back, the skills and mindsets he'd locked away. He told himself that he'd promised Maggie a peaceful life, that he was now a father, not a fighter. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, that vow felt weak against the fury rising inside him. The next morning, he knew he needed to talk to someone who understood the weight of his decision. He went to see Paul, an old SWAT buddy who now worked a quieter job in town. They met at a small, secluded bar outside the city, where John shared everything: his pain for Maggie, his anger, and his internal struggle. Paul listened, but when John expressed his desire to stand up to the vultures, Paul's face grew serious. "John, you're talking about confronting a gang, on your own," Paul warned. "These aren't amateurs, and you're not that man anymore. Do you really want to go back to that kind of violence?" But John's resolve was unshakable. His face hardened, and he looked Paul straight in the eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect her. If that means fighting again, then so be it." It was a turning point, a line John crossed in his heart. He left the bar determined and returned home with a quiet plan forming in his mind. Over the next few days, he began watching Razer's gang in secret. He noted their hangouts, their routes, their routines, each observation sharpening his focus. With every glimpse of them, every overheard conversation, he felt the tension mounting in his chest, the stirrings of a version of himself he'd thought was long dead. But this wasn't just about revenge. For John, it was about reclaiming his role as Maggie's protector, about showing his daughter, and himself, that he could still be the man she needed. And so, with a heavy heart but steady determination, John prepared himself for the battles that lay ahead. The days after Maggie's confession were filled with a tension that clung to the air, subtle but unmistakable. John Thompson watched his daughter more closely than ever, catching glimpses of her sadness, the way her shoulders slumped when she thought he wasn't looking, the feeling that he hadn't been there for her nod at him, a silent regret that spurred him into action. John knew that to truly help Maggie, he couldn't rely solely on his own fists or instincts. She needed a strength of her own. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, John looked at her, his voice soft but purposeful. "Mags," he began, "I want to teach you a few things. Ways to protect yourself if anything like that happens again." Maggie blinked, surprised, then hesitant. She'd never known her father's past beyond vague mentions of his work, but she trusted him, and for once she didn't see pity in his eyes, only pride and belief. Their training started in the mornings, before school, when the Texas sun was still low. John took her out to the backyard, where he had set up simple targets and markers. The drills were straightforward but intense, pushing Maggie's physical and mental limits. John showed her how to balance her stance, how to turn fear into focus, to use her weight and leverage in ways she'd never imagined. At first, Maggie stumbled and fumbled with frustration, but John was patient. "You're stronger than you think," he'd remind her, his voice calm but insistent. "This strength comes from here," he'd say, pointing to her heart. "It's about knowing what you're fighting for." One evening, after an especially difficult session, Maggie sank down on the grass, catching her breath. "Dad, sometimes the physical pain, it feels easier than everything else." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, John felt a pang of sorrow for all she had carried alone. Gently, he rested a hand on her shoulder. "The pain you feel, Mags, it's real. But so is the strength that's growing in you. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that." Meanwhile, John's own preparations were underway. His first goal was to understand everything he could about the vultures. He knew they had a network, that Razer was just the tip of a more intricate web. Disguised and careful to blend in, John began frequenting the bars and alleys where the gang gathered. He took note of every detail, their alliances, their habits, and, crucially, their weaknesses. One night, while tailing a few of them, his cover was almost blown. He had to act quickly, and before he knew it, he found himself cornered by two of Razer's men. The fight was fast, fierce, and a brutal reminder of his old skills. John used the cramped space to his advantage, dodging and striking with precision, taking down both men without drawing unwanted attention. By the end, he was bruised but had managed to slip away unnoticed, leaving behind a message of sorts, that he wasn't an easy target. But the close call had reminded him just how dangerous his plan was becoming. Back home, Maggie noticed the cuts on his knuckles, the faint bruise along his jaw. She didn't press, but her worried gaze said it all. "It's nothing," he assured her, brushing it off. Still, she stayed by his side, the unspoken understanding between them deepening. She could feel the shift in her father, the way his resolve had hardened, and it stirred something in her. Maggie was no longer the girl who'd stood helpless at the gas station. Underneath the worry, she felt a flicker of something new, a quiet determination that mirrored her father's. As the nights passed, Razer and his gang grew wary. They could sense someone was tracking them. Their conversations became shorter, their eyes darting around in search of a shadow that always slipped away before they could catch it. John knew he couldn't keep his surveillance up much longer without risking serious exposure. He had gathered enough to understand their patterns, to know which of Razer's allies would be the biggest threats if things came to a confrontation. One evening, after Maggie finished another grueling training session, she looked up at her father, her face a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. "Dad, I want to know everything. Whatever you're planning, I want to be part of it." Her voice was steady, unflinching, and John could see the same fire in her eyes that he'd felt for days. He hesitated, fearing the danger, but he also saw the resolve in her face, the strength that had grown within her. Gently, he shook his head. "I'm doing this so you don't have to, Mags," he replied, his tone firm but affectionate. "There's a line I don't want you to cross." That night, as they sat together in the quiet, John felt the weight of his decision. He would shield Maggie from the worst of this, but he also knew that this journey had already changed her. She was no longer his little girl. She was becoming someone braver, stronger, a fighter in her own right. But the pressure was mounting. Razer, now on high alert, had his men combing the city for any sign of their shadow. John sensed the ticking clock, the urgency to act before Razer grew too suspicious. He and his old SWAT friend, Paul, planned out a series of smaller attacks, strategic moves meant to chip away at the gang's confidence and resources without provoking a full-scale retaliation. John was playing a dangerous game, testing the limits of his own restraint and skill, but for Maggie, he'd stop at nothing. One night, after a successful mission sabotaging one of the gang's weapon supplies, John returned home only to find Razer had left his own message, a warning left in their front yard, a brutal reminder that the vultures didn't take kindly to interference. Maggie found it first, her face pale as she stared at the overturned soil and the twisted metal chain staked into the ground, a symbol of Razer's contempt. She looked up at her father, her fear barely contained. "I won't let them hurt you," John vowed, his voice low but unwavering. And though he still refused to let her join him, he knew that Maggie's involvement was inevitable, that their paths had become linked in this fight. In the quiet of the night, as Maggie lay awake, she felt her father's words echo in her mind. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small or helpless. She felt ready. And though she knew the path ahead was fraught with danger, she felt a newfound confidence, knowing that whatever came, they would face it together. John Thompson stood outside the local sheriff's office, the afternoon sun casting a heavy heat that only fueled his frustration. His jaw clenched as he prepared himself for the conversation he was about to have. The signs had been clear for a while. Razer's gang, the Vultures, had a grip on the town that went beyond intimidation. They had influence. But John, desperate to ensure Maggie's safety, had come here anyway, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone in authority would care enough to step in. Inside the station, the sheriff sat behind his desk, a large man with a calm but calculating look in his eyes. John wasted no time, laying out the incidents of harassment, the gang's activities, and even hinting at the recent threats near his home. The sheriff listened in silence, his expression never changing. When John finally finished, a heavy silence settled between them. The sheriff leaned back, fingers steepled as he let out a tired sigh. "John, I think you're overreacting," he said, a slight smirk flickering across his face. "These guys may be a nuisance, but they don't mess with folks unless folks mess with them." The words were laced with a mocking tone that stung more than any outright refusal. John's eyes narrowed as he tried to rein in his anger. "Maybe you don't understand what you're dealing with," John replied, his voice cold. "This isn't some harmless biker club. They're dangerous." The sheriff's eyes darkened, but his smirk didn't fade. "Maybe you don't understand the kind of men you're challenging." He paused, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Leave this alone, John. You don't want trouble you can't handle." Without another word, John turned on his heel and left, the sheriff's laughter ringing in his ears. He stepped out into the harsh sunlight, his chest tight with frustration. The message was clear. The town's supposed protectors had no interest in justice when it meant going up against Razer and his crew. John had wanted to avoid an all-out confrontation, but the sheriff's indifference left him no choice. If the authorities wouldn't stand up to the gang, he would do it alone. That night, the tension in the Thompson household was palpable. Maggie had sensed something was wrong as soon as he returned, his expression grim and distant. She pressed him, but John only offered vague reassurances, unwilling to burden her with the weight of his failed attempt at justice. But she saw through his calm facade, her worry deepening as she watched him silently check and recheck the locks on their doors and windows. Despite the fear hanging over them, their training sessions continued. Maggie's body ached from the physical toll, bruises forming on her arms and legs, but she refused to let up. The pain, she told herself, was a reminder of her resilience. One evening, after an intense training session that left her breathless, she stumbled and fell to her knees. John rushed to her side, but she shook her head, determined. "The pain today is nothing compared to what I've carried inside for years," she said, her voice raw but resolute. Her words struck a chord deep within him, and John saw in her eyes a strength he hadn't fully realized before. With a mix of pride and sorrow, he helped her up, placing a hand on her cheek. "You're stronger than I ever knew, Mags. But remember, the fight isn't just about physical strength." Maggie nodded, her face set with a newfound determination. Meanwhile, John's plan to dismantle the vultures was in motion. He had started identifying key spots, the gang's favorite bars, their storage spots, and their allies within the town. Together with Paul, his former SWAT partner, he began launching small, targeted strikes against their operations. It started with sabotaging their drug supplies, cutting off one of Razer's main sources of income. The hits were quick, precise, and always under the cover of night, leaving no trace except for the loss Razer's gang would feel in their wallets. One night, after another successful raid, John left a sign, a crude X scrawled on the wall of the warehouse, a taunt aimed directly at Razer. It was a bold, reckless move, but it served its purpose. By morning, the gang was in an uproar, furious at the message and the audacity of their unseen enemy. Razer himself was livid, his reputation at stake, and he ordered his men to double their watch, sniffing out any stranger or outsider. The retaliation was swift. In the dead of night, 2 of Razer's men broke into the Thompsons' yard, tearing through their belongings and leaving a message of their own, a shattered garden light and a trail of broken items strewn across the porch. Maggie found it the next morning, her hands trembling as she picked up the pieces. It was a warning, a clear threat from Razer to back down, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She ran inside, where John was already on edge, sensing the danger. John's resolve only hardened. As he surveyed the damage, his face darkened, his jaw clenched with an intensity Maggie hadn't seen before. She begged him to let her help, but he refused, the protectiveness of a father overriding the fighter she had become. "This is my fight, Maggie," he said, his voice low but fierce. "You've done enough by standing with me. Now, it's my turn to protect you." The days that followed were tense, each night bringing fresh fears and new dangers. Maggie, though kept out of the confrontations, felt the strain, her heart pounding each time her father stepped out to meet Paul, preparing for the next strike. Despite her father's attempts to shield her, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were in this together, bound by a common enemy and a shared resolve. On a sweltering Friday night, John and Paul planned their next move. Razer had scheduled a large weapons shipment, a convoy that would travel through a remote stretch of highway just outside town. It was a risky plan, but if they succeeded in intercepting it, they would deal a crushing blow to Razer's power. Paul looked at John, his face etched with concern. "Are you sure about this, John? This isn't just about the gang anymore. It's about what you're willing to risk." John's gaze was steely, unyielding. "I'm willing to risk everything to keep her safe." As they set their plan into motion, John knew the stakes were higher than ever. The path he'd chosen was dangerous, filled with the ghosts of his past and the threat of his present. But for Maggie, he would face every fear, fight every enemy, and challenge anyone who dared to stand in his way. Under a dark, moonless sky, John and Paul crouched silently in the dense underbrush just off the highway, waiting for Razer's convoy. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and diesel, and every creak and rustle in the silence heightened their senses. They'd planned meticulously, choosing this remote stretch of road where Razer's gang would feel most vulnerable, and where any call for backup would be slow to reach. It was past midnight when the faint hum of engines broke the quiet. The rumble grew louder, and soon the convoy came into view, a line of motorcycles and 2 cargo trucks carrying the gang's latest arms shipment. John and Paul exchanged a quick look, their silent confirmation to go ahead. In one swift move, John positioned himself along the edge of the road with a high-powered flashlight. As the convoy neared, he flashed the beam directly into the lead biker's eyes, forcing the rider to swerve violently, bringing the entire line of motorcycles to a halt. Chaos erupted as the convoy came to an abrupt stop. John and Paul took advantage of the confusion, slipping out of the shadows and throwing a string of makeshift tire spikes across the road to trap the trucks. As bikers scrambled to recover, John launched himself at the closest man, a quick and brutal takedown that left the gang member sprawled in the dust before he even had a chance to react. Meanwhile, Paul had already moved to the side of one of the trucks, wrenching open the door and dragging out the driver. He secured the truck, using it as a blockade across the narrow road to prevent any escape. The few bikers who managed to pull themselves together came charging at them, and in seconds, John was engaged in a fierce, close-quarters fight. Every punch, every block, every throw reminded him of his Swat days, the violent reflexes surging back as if no time had passed. Just as the last of the bikers tried to regroup, Razer's unmistakable figure emerged from the back of one of the trucks. With a twisted grin and a mocking wave, he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on John. "So you're the one causing all this trouble," Razer sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Didn't anyone tell you this town belongs to us?" John felt a rush of anger, but he kept his expression calm, his stance steady. "Not anymore," he replied, his voice cold and controlled. Razer let out a low chuckle, raising his hands in a gesture that taunted John, daring him to make a move. The fight that ensued was brutal. Razer's punches were heavy and relentless, his brawler's strength a sharp contrast to John's calculated precision. John dodged and weaved, landing blows when he could, but Razer was relentless, hurling insults about Maggie, each one stoking the fire inside John. Finally, after a savage exchange, John's fist connected with Razer's jaw, sending him staggering backward. With Razer down, John's instinct urged him to end it right there, to finally rid himself and Maggie of this threat. But a moment's hesitation held him back. He wanted Razer to face justice, not death. Razer lay on the ground, stunned and defeated, but still sneering, his pride shattered. The rest of Razer's men, seeing their leader beaten, quickly dispersed, retreating into the darkness, their bikes roaring to life as they fled. Paul quickly checked the trucks, ensuring their cargo would be impounded and inaccessible to the gang. Razer, wounded and cornered, was cuffed and dragged to the side of the road by Paul, who cast a wary glance at John. They'd won the battle, but both men knew that the larger war was not over. As dawn approached, John and Paul returned home, exhausted but resolute. The air in the Thompson household was filled with a quiet relief, and when Maggie saw her father, battered but alive, she rushed to his side, her face a mixture of fear, pride, and determination. She helped him tend to his injuries, her hands steady as she cleaned his cuts, a silence of understanding settling between them. She knew, without him saying a word, that this was far from over. In a rare, quiet moment that night, they sat together, and John finally shared what lay heavy on his heart. "I'll always protect you, Maggie. But this fight, it's dangerous. I can't lose you." Maggie met his gaze, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Dad, I know the risks, but you don't have to face this alone. I'm here, no matter what." She leaned in, resting her hand on his, a silent promise that whatever happened, they would face it together. Meanwhile, Razer's men, scattered and weakened, were desperate. Razer himself, humiliated and nursing his wounds, knew his grip on the town was slipping. He realized that to regain his standing, he'd have to make a brutal example of John and his family. The word quickly spread among his remaining men that there would be one last showdown, and Razer, fueled by vengeance, was determined to make it unforgettable. As the tension mounted in town, John and Paul prepared for the final confrontation. They knew Razer's pride wouldn't allow him to simply accept defeat. Maggie, too, sensed the unease, and despite her father's attempts to keep her safe, she became a part of their preparations, helping in any way she could, her resolve strengthening as the stakes grew higher. The final battle loomed closer, casting a shadow over everything, but in the quiet hours before the storm, the Thompsons found a strange sense of peace. They had already come so far, had already sacrificed so much, and now, standing together, they were ready for whatever came next. With resolve and unwavering determination, John and Maggie prepared themselves for the fight of their lives, knowing that win or lose, they'd face it as a family, side by side, against all odds. The storm had been building all day, the sky churning with thick, dark clouds as night fell, mirroring the tension that had taken hold of the town. John and Paul were ready, positioned near an abandoned stretch of highway where Razer had planned his ambush. They had anticipated his desperation and knew Razer wouldn't stop until he had reclaimed control, no matter the cost. As rain began to fall, it beat down on the road with an intensity that blurred everything, making the scene even more foreboding. John tightened his grip on the handle of his flashlight, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness. Beside him, Paul steadied his breathing, every nerve alert, the rain running in rivulets down his face. Maggie had begged to come, but John had been adamant. This was a fight he didn't want her to witness. He'd made her promise to stay safe at home, though the thought of her alone weighed on his mind. The first lights appeared in the distance, and John's heart rate quickened. Razer's gang approached, engines roaring, their headlights cutting through the downpour. They came in a staggered formation, their numbers reduced but still menacing, led by Razer himself, his figure unmistakable at the front. The plan was clear. Razer intended to overwhelm them, using the sheer force of his gang to show John that this was his territory. When the convoy was within range, John and Paul leaped into action, throwing down spike strips across the road. The rain had slickened the asphalt, and as the bikes hit the spikes, tires burst and skidded wildly. 2 bikes went down immediately, their riders thrown to the ground as their machines spun out of control. Chaos erupted as Razer's men scrambled, disoriented by the sudden trap and the fierce rain pounding down. John charged forward, his movements swift and controlled. In seconds, he was face to face with one of Razer's top men, a giant with tattoos snaking up his arms. The man swung a metal pipe at John, but John ducked, using the man's momentum to pull him forward and send him sprawling onto the ground. With a quick, decisive kick, John knocked him out cold before turning to the next threat. Paul had his own battle raging, locked in combat with two gang members who'd managed to keep their footing. He fought with a calm precision, years of SWAT training evident in every punch and block. The rain made every movement treacherous, each strike met with resistance as the gang fought with brutal desperation. And then, through the chaos, John saw Razer. Standing by his bike, Razer had drawn a knife, his eyes locked on John with a hatred that was almost tangible. He pointed the knife at John, his lips curling into a mocking sneer. "Thought you could take my town, Thompson?" Razer taunted, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. "Big mistake." John moved toward him, his body tense, muscles coiled and ready. "It's over, Razer. This ends tonight," he shouted back, his voice steady, unwavering. They began to circle each other, the rain slashing down between them like a curtain, blurring the world to just the two of them. The fight was savage. Razer lunged, swinging the knife in quick, violent arcs. John dodged, narrowly escaping each strike, his training and experience keeping him just a step ahead. But Razer was relentless, and his sheer fury gave him a terrifying strength. He slashed wildly, his blade grazing John's arm, sending a sharp, burning pain through him. John gritted his teeth, ignoring the sting as he retaliated, landing a solid punch that made Razer stagger. But Razer recovered quickly, laughing through the blood trickling down his lip. "Is that all you've got?" he sneered, lunging forward again. John ducked, using the slippery ground to his advantage as he twisted Razer's arm, forcing the knife from his grasp. Razer growled in frustration, swinging a punch that connected with John's jaw, sending him stumbling back. In the next instant, they were grappling on the ground, each man fighting with everything he had. Razer's insults about Maggie echoed in John's ears, fueling his resolve. With a surge of strength, he threw Razer off, landing a series of blows that left Razer gasping, his arrogance fading as he realized he was losing. The rest of Razer's gang, seeing their leader defeated, began to back away. The few remaining bikers looked at each other, hesitant, and then slowly retreated, their loyalty dissolving as Razer lay on the ground, beaten. The storm continued to rage around them, but in that moment it felt as though John had found a strange sense of peace. As Razer lay there, bloodied and breathless, John stood over him, his face resolute. For a moment, the thought crossed his mind to end it right there. To make sure Razer could never threaten Maggie, or anyone else, again. But instead, he took a deep breath, letting go of the anger that had fueled him for so long. "You're finished," John said, his voice firm. "You'll never hurt my daughter again." At that moment, headlights appeared on the road behind them. Maggie had arrived, despite his orders, watching her father from a distance. She'd followed him, unable to stay behind, and as she saw him standing victorious, she felt a mixture of relief and pride she couldn't describe. She rushed to his side, ignoring the mud and rain, her arms wrapping around him in silent gratitude. John held her close, the weight of the night's battle settling over him. He looked down at her, his voice gentle. "I told you to stay safe." Maggie smiled through her tears. "I am safe, Dad, because of you." With Razer defeated and his gang scattered, John and Maggie returned home, leaving behind the darkness of that highway and the fear that had haunted them for so long. They knew there would be more to face, but in that moment they had won. Father and daughter, united and unbreakable. In the days following the stormy showdown, a fragile calm settled over the town. With Razer captured, the remnants of his gang scattered, too afraid to challenge John or the local authorities who, finally shaken by the depth of Razer's crimes, had stepped in to secure the town's peace. John and Paul had provided more than enough evidence of the gang's illegal operations to ensure state authorities took action, and now the last of the vultures were being hunted down. For the first time in weeks, Maggie felt she could walk through town without fear. She held her head high, her eyes no longer darting with apprehension, and for the first time her confidence felt like armor. At school, the whispers that used to follow her now shifted to glances of respect and curiosity. Her transformation, both inside and out, was apparent to everyone, and Maggie embraced it, no longer burdened by the opinions of others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Texas horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Maggie and John shared a quiet dinner. They both sensed the shift in their relationship, a new, deeper bond forged in the fires of the last few weeks. They were no longer just father and daughter. They were allies, survivors of a trial that had tested their strength and resolve. After dinner, John received a call from Paul, who was overseeing the final sweep of Razer's old hideouts with the authorities. Razer, having been held for questioning, had revealed the locations of hidden caches of weapons and cash used to fund the gang's operations. But one last target remained, Razer's second-in-command, a vicious enforcer named Burke, who had evaded every attempt to capture him and had vowed revenge on John and anyone close to him. The next morning, news spread through town. Burke had been spotted near the edge of town, hiding out and waiting for an opportunity to strike back. John knew that this wasn't over yet. Burke was more than a gang member. He was Razer's closest ally, and his loyalty was absolute. If he remained free, neither John nor Maggie would ever be safe. John and Paul gathered what information they had, learning that Burke had holed up in a small warehouse on the outskirts of town. This wasn't just a safe house, it was a fortified hideout, a final line of defense for anyone desperate enough to face off against him. The police were preparing a raid, but John felt the old instincts kick in, a certainty that this fight was personal. He couldn't wait and risk Burke escaping to regroup or finding another way to exact his revenge. As night fell, John prepared to confront Burke. Before leaving, he found Maggie waiting by the door, her face a mixture of worry and determination. She'd sensed his plan and insisted on going with him. This time, John met her gaze and nodded. He knew there was no stopping her now. Together, they set out for the warehouse, their steps purposeful, the weight of finality in the air. When they arrived, the warehouse loomed in the darkness, its windows shattered, and metal panels rusted and torn. The faint glow of a single light inside betrayed Burke's presence, along with the sound of muffled voices and the occasional scrape of footsteps. Paul, who had arrived moments before, stood at the ready, giving John a silent nod. John entered first, moving with quiet precision, Maggie close behind him. They slipped through a side entrance, keeping low as they navigated through the maze of crates and broken equipment. Every shadow seemed to breathe, and the silence was thick, amplifying each creak and rustle. Then a voice cut through the dark. "Thompson, I knew you'd come." Burke's voice was cold and mocking, and John's grip tightened. Maggie could see the resolve in her father's face as they moved closer to the center of the warehouse. Burke stepped into view, a menacing figure with scars crisscrossing his forearms and a rifle in his hands, his eyes gleaming with a wild intensity. "You took everything from us," Burke spat, his words laced with venom. "You think you can walk away from this, pretend like you're some hero?" John's face was expressionless as he replied, his voice steady. "I did what I had to do, to protect my family and to bring justice to this town." Burke sneered, leveling his rifle at John. But before he could fire, Maggie acted, tossing a metal pipe she'd grabbed across the room. The loud clang was enough to distract Burke, giving John the second he needed to lunge forward. He tackled Burke, forcing him to drop the rifle, and they crashed to the ground, the struggle fierce and unrelenting. The fight was brutal, each man drawing on every ounce of strength and skill. Burke was strong, his movements fueled by rage, but John fought with purpose, each blow calculated and precise. Maggie watched, her heart pounding, but she held back, knowing this was a battle John needed to finish alone. At last, John gained the upper hand, pinning Burke to the ground, his face inches away from his. Burke laughed, a twisted, bitter sound. "This isn't over," he rasped. "There'll always be more of us." John stared down at him, his voice low and unwavering. "Not for you. Not anymore." Moments later, Paul entered, his backup having secured the perimeter. They apprehended Burke, ensuring he would be delivered to the authorities. For John and Maggie, the battle was finally over. They left the warehouse in silence, the weight of victory settling over them. For the first time, they felt the full relief of safety, of freedom from fear. As they walked into the early dawn, John placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder, pulling her close. In the following days, the town began to change, slowly reclaiming its peace. Razer and Burke's gang was dismantled, and those who had once been too afraid to stand up began to rebuild their lives. Maggie returned to school, no longer the girl who'd been burdened by others' judgments. She walked with confidence, her head held high, her heart light. One evening, as John and Maggie sat on their porch, watching the sunset, she looked at him with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." John smiled, his hand resting over hers. "You were my reason, Maggie. I'd do it all again for you." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together in a comfortable silence, knowing they were stronger together and that no threat could ever break the bond they'd forged through fire, love, and unyielding courage.